Balance is a key concept for health, and it applies to medicine as well, and orthopedics is no exception. The musculoskeletal system has to balance in several different ways, and I argue that we're dismissing one key part of that balancing act, if you will. People tend to think of strengthening as something you balance out. For example, those who strengthen the biceps and the anterior arm tend to also want to strengthen their triceps and the posterior arm. Stretching is also similar. People who are stretching the hamstrings in the back of the thigh think about, let me also stretch the hip flexors and the quads in the front of my thigh. And I agree with these ideas. I believe that that type of balancing is helpful. But what we're missing in a lot of conversations is the idea of moving in opposite directions regarding joints. An obvious example would be something like someone who sits slouched for 8 hours in spine flexion. I don't think many of those people are thinking, I need to do some joint extension of my spine to balance it out. Or someone who is protruded looking at a computer screen with their neck all day, thinking to him or herself, I need to retract my neck in the opposite direction to do some balancing. And the balancing act here is not one-to-one, keep in mind. We're not designed to have to move thousands of times backwards to compensate for the thousands of times we bend or flex forward every day. But I argue that there needs to be some form of balance to keep a joint healthy. An injury, after all, that's from an acute event, like a fall, is the critical acute non-balancing of a joint, right? It's an acute force in one specific direction. Of course, not all traumas are like that, but that's how I kind of envision some joint derangements, some joint pathologies that occur acutely. Conversely, they can occur chronically over time with lots of force in one direction and possibly no force or minimal force in the other direction. So when I think about keeping a body healthy, I think about stretching on different sides of the joints and limb, strengthening as well on both sides, but also moving into those directions in opposing ways to end range when possible. So for example, going to the gym, if you're doing squats and sit-ups and stretching your hamstrings by bending forward and stretching your calf muscles by bending forward, you can think to yourself, well, this is a lot of spine joint flexion. Let me balance it out with some spine joint extension. And of course, this applies to ankle joints and knees and shoulders. And it's not just in the sagittal plane regarding flexion and extension. This balancing also applies to rotation in the transverse plane and movements in the frontal plane. And athletes have to think about this stuff as well. If I were a golfer and I was only swinging in one direction hundreds of times per day, it would behoove me to rotate in the opposite direction as well to balance out those joints. So I don't see many people, or I don't think many people are thinking about this when I gave that gym example. How many times they're flexing at the gym and moving into extension would be a part or a way to minimize potential risk of injury, but also just to keep some normal balance in their spine. So yes, think about stretching and strengthening as balancing different parts of the body, but also think of mobility as something we do to balance the body. If you spend all day in hip external rotation, it might behoove you to go to internal rotation. At the very least, if there's an injury that's mediated by the hip joint, we need to start to think, okay, what position is this joint in all day? If it is in hip external rotation all day with sitting, for example, maybe we need to restore hip internal rotation, partly correcting that imbalance, if you will, as the precise therapy. So think about joint balance when you can. I argue that we need to have some form of balance, not necessarily one-to-one, but some form of balance through our joints to keep them mobile and healthy.